Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely profound. We're taking a close look at a monumental documentary project called 13 Years of Mortality, A Journey Beyond Life. And we're going to use this whole 16:9 widescreen canvas to explore a topic literally every single one of us has a stake in, but let's be honest, very few of us actually want to look at directly. But hey, that's exactly what we do here. We're going to break down the sheer massive scope of this project, exploring the data, the history, and the incredibly deep investigations this film brings to the table. We have a ton of fascinating ground to cover, so let's just dive right in.
So, what actually happens when life ends? It's such a simple question, right? Just a few short words, yet it carries this incredible, almost gravitational weight. This is the core question that drives the absolute entirety of the documentary we're unpacking today. It's the catalyst for the whole shebang. Now, for most of us, this is something we might just quietly ponder late at night, or maybe when we're dealing with a personal loss. But think about this. What happens when you don't just ponder it? What happens when you make answering this specific question your literal life's work?
13. I really want you to just sit with that number for a second. 13 years. The creators of this documentary dedicated 13 solid years of their lives to studying death. Just think about what that requires for a moment. That is over a decade of waking up, grabbing your morning coffee, and actively choosing to stare right into the abyss. It's a massive, truly unprecedented dedication of time just to map out a mystery of this scale. You know, you don't spend 13 years on a single project unless you are uncovering layers of truth that absolutely demand to be synthesized. It's this crazy timeline that takes us from a simple inquiry and turns it into a monumental, comprehensive study.
Now, exploring the mystery through science, philosophy, religion, psychology, and real-life experiences. You really can't just look at death from one single angle, right? It's way too vast. So the documentary tackles it through these 5 distinct lenses. First up, science, looking at the hard, biological, and neurological facts. Then, philosophy, asking the fundamental logic behind our existence. Next, religion, tapping into the spiritual frameworks and ancient texts that have guided us for millennia. Fourth is psychology, how our minds process our own end and the profound grief of losing others. And finally, real-life experiences, that raw, anecdotal evidence from people who've brushed right up against the edge. It's a brilliant approach because it refracts that big core question through multiple disciplines. Literally, no stone left unturned.
Moving on to humanity's oldest mystery, ancient and cultural beliefs. Look, before we can jump into the modern data, we kind of have to look backward. Every civilization, every culture, every tribe throughout recorded history has had to grapple with mortality. The filmmakers actually spent a huge chunk of their 13 years examining how our ancestors tried to understand what happens when life ends. They looked at early rituals, ancient texts, and belief systems built to make sense of the void. Grasping these ancient perspectives is absolutely crucial because it sets the baseline for our entire human search for meaning.
Let's look at this timeline from the ancient era's earliest cultural beliefs through the modern era's advanced medical research, all the way to this 13-year investigative synthesis. There's a really distinct progression here in how we've approached the great unknown. We start with the ancient era, where mythology and early spirituality did the heavy lifting. Then, moving forward in time, we hit the modern era. This is where advanced medical research steps in, bringing things like brainwave scans and clinical data into the mix. And finally, we arrive at the 13-year span of the documentary itself. This project is essentially the bridge, weaving the ancient and the modern together into one comprehensive narrative.
Here we have ancient cultural beliefs versus modern medical research. It's a totally fascinating contrast. On one hand, you've got the domain of the spiritual, the mythological, and the philosophical frameworks built purely around faith and tradition. On the other hand, modern medical research brings the clinical, measurable facts surrounding biological death right into the light. And what this documentary does so incredibly well is that it doesn't try to tell you which side is right. It neutrally presents how experts and civilizations from both sides of the divide have historically approached the exact same inevitable event. It's a super compelling juxtaposition between what we feel in our souls and what we can actually measure with our machines.
Okay, let's look at the edge of life. Near-death experiences. I want to slow the pacing down for just a second here, because the source material takes a very specific, very curious look into this unique phenomenon. This is the gray area, right? It's not quite life as we know it, and it's definitely not final biological death. The documentary dedicates some serious focus to these profound, real-life events, people who have effectively flatlined, crossed over that threshold, and then come back. What do they actually see? It's wild because many report striking similarities, a feeling of overwhelming peace, separating from the physical body, or a profound shift in how they understand love. By documenting these realities, the filmmakers aren't just giving us dry medical statistics. They're acting as our guide through the deeply personal edge of life.
So, the documentary's approach examine historical beliefs neutrally, analyze modern medical data, document near-death realities, and synthesize without bias. How exactly do you manage all that heavy information? Well, over 13 years, the creators followed a really strict methodology to stay objective. First, examine historical beliefs neutrally, meaning they didn't play favorites with ancient religions. Second, analyze modern medical data, just letting the science speak for itself without over-extrapolating. Third, document near-death realities, gathering those human experiences as real empirical evidence. And finally, synthesize without bias. They gathered the whole shebang from across the human experience and laid it out purely for your consideration.
Now for the definition of mortality. The state of being subject to death, the central catalyst for humanity's search for meaning. It's that second part of the definition that really grounds our explainer today. The documentary ultimately reveals a massive paradox. Studying death isn't actually about the end at all. It is entirely about the present. It's the very fact that we are mortal, that our time here is limited, that literally forces us to seek out meaning, purpose, and connection while we're still here. To study death is basically to study life.
And that brings us to the meaning of existence. This ultimate search for meaning is the philosophical core of this entire 13-year journey. You see, the filmmakers didn't spend over a decade investigating science, religion, and near-death experiences just to hand you a grim report on human biology. No way. They did it to totally reframe how we look at our own existence. By staring directly into the great unknown, the documentary really prepares us to ask much better questions about how we are spending our days right now.
Let's check out the 13-year takeaway. Presents compelling evidence, explores diverse ideas, raises profound questions, encourages deep reflection, and avoids definitive answers. This massive project does something highly unusual for a documentary. It presents all this compelling evidence, explores diverse ideas across all those disciplines, and raises incredibly profound questions. It really encourages deep reflection from you. But crucially, and this is a real game changer, it actively avoids definitive answers. That is exactly what makes this analysis so powerful. It doesn't claim to have neatly solved humanity's oldest mystery. Instead, it just provides the unbiased information you need to think deeply for yourself.
Let's read this quote. Rather than providing definitive answers, it presents evidence, ideas, and questions that encourage viewers to think deeply about life, mortality, and the meaning of existence. The source text really just brings it all together with this core thesis. It brilliantly encapsulates the climax of the documentary's arc. The big realization here is that the search itself is the meaning. Those 13 years of investigation weren't meant to close the book on death. They were literally meant to open our minds to the vastness of life.
So, what do you believe happens after death? I want to leave you with this final, truly provocative thought. After looking at all this evidence, what do you think happens? We've explored the ancient beliefs, the modern medical science, the wild near-death experiences, and the heavy philosophical weight of 13 years of intense study. Now I'm turning the question over to you. The evidence has been presented. I highly encourage you to reflect on everything we've synthesized today and definitely jump down into the comments to share your own conclusions and theories. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the ultimate unknown. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.